The unusual job. Jake Reynolds was not your average mechanic. He wasn't the type who just fixed cars or replaced engine parts in a dusty workshop. Jake had a gift, an instinct to understand machines, no matter how complex they were. He was the go-to guy when people brought in gadgets they didn't even know the names of. From drones to spacecraft components, Jake could fix it all. But even with his impressive reputation, he never expected to get a job like this. It started on a quiet Thursday afternoon in his small workshop on the outskirts of New Haven. Jake was wiping grease off his hands when his communicator buzzed. A message popped up, marked urgent, highly confidential. Curious, Jake tapped it open. We need your expertise on a delicate repair. Transportation provided. Payment negotiable upon success. The message had no sender's name or details. Jake raised an eyebrow. Normally, he wouldn't entertain such vague requests, but something about it intrigued him. Maybe it was the promise of adventure or the allure of a hefty paycheck. After all, his rent was overdue, and his equipment wasn't going to pay for itself. Within an hour, a sleek black vehicle arrived at his workshop. The driver, a stern-looking woman in a uniform Jake didn't recognize, handed him a tablet. "Sign here," she said without much explanation. Jake hesitated. "What exactly am I agreeing to?" "You're agreeing to get paid handsomely for doing what you do best," she replied with a thin smile. Jake chuckled and signed. "All right, lead the way." The vehicle took him far from the city, past industrial zones, and into an isolated hangar surrounded by high-security fences. Jake noticed cameras mounted everywhere, and guards patrolling with unusual weapons. It felt more like a military base than a repair site. The hangar doors slid open, revealing a sight that made Jake's jaw drop. In the center of the massive space sat a ship unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its sleek, silver surface shimmered faintly, as though it wasn't entirely solid. The design was alien, literally. "Is this some kind of joke?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "No joke," the woman said. "This ship crash-landed 2 days ago. We need you to fix it." Jake took a cautious step closer. He could see scorch marks along the hull and strange, jagged fractures running down its sides. It looked like it had been through hell. "Who owns this thing?" Jake asked, running his fingers along the smooth surface. The woman hesitated, then gestured toward a shadowy corner of the hangar. Jake followed her gaze and froze. Lying on a stretcher, surrounded by blinking medical equipment, was the most bizarre creature he had ever seen. The alien was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like the ship's surface. Its limbs were long and thin, almost insect-like, and its face had a mix of sharp and soft features. Large black eyes, no visible nose, and a mouth that looked more decorative than functional. Tubes and wires were connected to its body, and it appeared unconscious. "That's the pilot," the woman said. Jake blinked, unsure how to respond. "You're telling me I have to fix an alien ship and deal with the pilot?" "The ship is your main priority," she replied. "But the pilot's condition is tied to the ship. If one fails, so does the other." Jake let out a low whistle. This just keeps getting better. Despite his initial shock, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his toolkit and approached the ship. Up close, he could see strange symbols etched into the hull, symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when he looked too closely. "This isn't metal," Jake muttered, tapping the surface. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive. "Be careful," the woman warned. "We have no idea how it works." Jake smirked. That's half the fun. As he started his inspection, Jake quickly realized the ship was more than just damaged. It was falling apart. The internal systems were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Wires glowed faintly, pulsing like veins. Panels opened and closed on their own, revealing components that seemed to change shape. "What kind of tech is this?" Jake muttered under his breath. He pulled out a diagnostic scanner. but the device short-circuited the moment it touched the ship. "Figures," he said, tossing the useless scanner aside. He would have to rely on his instincts. Hours passed as Jake carefully examined the ship. He discovered that the engine core had been severely damaged, likely from some kind of energy weapon. The life support systems were partially functional but unstable. Just as he was about to take a break, a faint sound caught his attention. A low, raspy breath. Jake turned toward the stretcher. The alien pilot was stirring. Jake froze, unsure what to do. The pilot's eyes fluttered open, revealing an eerie black glow. It looked straight at Jake, its gaze sharp despite its weakened state. Hi," Jake said awkwardly, raising a hand in a half-wave. The alien's mouth opened, and it spoke in a language Jake couldn't understand. The sound was a mix of clicks and hums, almost musical. "I don't understand you," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. He glanced at the woman, but she seemed just as startled as he was. The alien struggled to sit up, but its limbs trembled. Jake instinctively moved closer, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy there," he said. "You're not in great shape." The alien's gaze softened slightly, and it slumped back onto the stretcher. Jake sighed in relief but couldn't shake the feeling that this job was going to be far more complicated than he'd signed up for. As he turned back to the ship, he felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. Fixing this thing would be the challenge of a lifetime. But deep down, Jake knew it wasn't just the ship that needed fixing. And that thought left him wondering what he had really gotten himself into. Alien engineering. Jake couldn't sleep that night, not that he expected to. The alien ship consumed his thoughts, a puzzle so complex it felt like it was mocking him. He sat on a bench just inside the hangar, staring at the shimmering hull. The alien pilot, Celerin, as the woman had finally named him, remained unconscious but stable on the stretcher nearby. The medical devices attached to him hummed quietly, pulsing in sync with his shallow breaths. Jake sighed, grabbing his toolkit again. He didn't know much about alien biology, but he knew one thing. If this ship wasn't fixed, Celerin wouldn't make it. The systems were so intertwined it felt like the ship and the pilot were one organism. The idea unsettled Jake, but it also fascinated him. "All right," Jake muttered, approaching the ship again. "Let's see what you've got for me." He started with the external panels, looking for anything that resembled an access point. After some trial and error, he found a section of the hull that responded to his touch. The metal, if it was even metal, shifted and folded away, revealing a glowing network of what could only be described as veins. "Veins in a spaceship," Jake whispered, shaking his head. He reached out with a gloved hand, carefully tracing one of the glowing lines. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. When nothing exploded, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Okay, progress. He followed the glowing pathways, noting how they seemed to converge near the rear of the ship. A central core, perhaps. The more he studied the structure, the more he realized it didn't follow any human engineering principles. This ship wasn't built, it was grown. Jake frowned. What kind of species grows their technology? As he worked, he began to notice strange patterns. Every time he interacted with a component, the ship seemed to react, adjusting itself subtly. It was as though the ship was alive and watching him. "Creepy," Jake muttered, but he couldn't stop now. Hours passed as Jake carefully mapped out the internal systems. He discovered that the ship's main engine core was heavily damaged, likely from the same attack that had downed it. The core emitted a faint, irregular hum, like a heartbeat on the verge of stopping. Surrounding the core were dozens of crystalline structures, each glowing faintly. Jake leaned closer, examining one of the crystals. It was fractured, with tiny shards missing. He tapped it gently with a tool, and the crystal emitted a soft, musical tone. "What are you?" Jake whispered, marveling at the sound. Suddenly, the tone changed, becoming sharper, almost urgent. The ship shuddered faintly, and Jake stumbled back, alarmed. "Hey, easy," he said, holding up his hands. The ship stilled, and the glow from the crystals dimmed slightly. Jake glanced toward Selrin, who remained motionless on the stretcher. The devices monitoring him flickered briefly, as though affected by the ship's reaction. Jake realized something important. The ship wasn't just linked to Selrin. It was trying to communicate with him. "Great," Jake muttered. "Now I have 2 patients." Determined to figure out the connection, Jake returned to the central core. He carefully removed one of the smaller, intact crystals, holding it up to the light. The crystal was warm in his hand, and tiny patterns shifted within it, like a snow globe in motion. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a low melodic hum. He turned to see Selrin's eyes open again, glowing faintly. The alien's gaze was fixed on the crystal in Jake's hand. "You recognize this, don't you?" Jake asked, keeping his voice calm. Selrin didn't respond, but his eyes tracked the crystal as Jake moved it closer. The alien's breathing grew steadier, and the medical devices around him stabilized. Jake frowned. "Is this keeping you alive?" Selrin blinked slowly, and Jake took it as a yes. He carefully placed the crystal back into its slot near the core. The ship let out a soft, harmonious tone, and Jake felt the tension in the air ease slightly. "All right," Jake said, wiping his brow. "I get it. You and this ship are connected. But if I'm going to fix this thing, I need to understand how it works." He turned to Selrin, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Can you understand me?" The alien tilted his head, and for a moment, Jake thought he might get a response. Then Selrin raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the ship. "You want me to keep working?" Jake guessed. Selrin blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. "All right then," Jake said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's get to it." Jake spent the next few hours testing his theories. He discovered that the ship's systems responded to specific patterns of sound, almost like a musical instrument. By mimicking the tones emitted by the crystals, he was able to access deeper layers of the ship's structure. Each new discovery brought more questions. What kind of species built this? Why was Selrin so intertwined with the ship? And most importantly, who had attacked them? As Jake worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by Selrin, but by the ship itself. The glowing veins seemed to pulse more strongly when he made progress, almost as if encouraging him. By the time Jake took a break, he was exhausted but exhilarated. He had managed to stabilize the ship's core and repair some of the life support systems, but there was still so much he didn't understand. Jake glanced at Selrin, who had drifted back into unconsciousness. The alien's breathing was steady, but Jake knew time was running out. "This isn't just a job anymore," Jake muttered to himself. "This is survival, for both of us." As he leaned back against the wall, staring at the shimmering ship, Jake realized he was in way over his head. But for the first time in years, he felt alive. He didn't just have a machine to fix, he had a mystery to solve. A fragile trust. Jake awoke to the sound of a faint rhythmic hum. For a moment, he thought it was the ship again. But as he opened his eyes, he realized the sound was coming from the alien pilot, Selrin. The alien was sitting upright on the stretcher, his hands moving in slow, deliberate motions through the air. The hum rose and fell, forming patterns Jake couldn't decipher, like a melody with no beginning or end. Jake rubbed his eyes and stood cautiously. "You're awake," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Selrin turned his head, his large black eyes locking onto Jake. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was something else. Curiosity, maybe even gratitude. "Glad to see you're feeling better," Jake said, gesturing toward the stretcher. "Though I wouldn't recommend moving around too much. You're still hooked up to a lot of stuff." The alien didn't respond with words, but his hands moved again, tracing shapes in the air. This time, the hum changed, becoming sharper and more deliberate. Jake felt a strange sensation in his chest, as though the sound was resonating directly with his heartbeat. What is that?" Jake asked, stepping closer. Zellerin paused, tilting his head slightly. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he pointed toward the ship. The gesture was clear. "The answer lies there." Jake sighed. "Of course it does. You guys really don't do anything the easy way, do you?" Deciding to humor the alien, Jake approached the ship again. The strange, shimmering hull seemed to react to his presence, rippling faintly like water. He placed his hand on the surface, and a panel slid open, revealing a set of crystalline controls. Jake glanced back at Zellerin. "You want me to try something, don't you?" The alien nodded slowly. "Great," Jake muttered. "Let's hope I don't blow us both up." He studied the controls carefully, noting how the crystals seemed to align with the glowing veins running through the ship. It was a symphony of light and sound, and Jake realized the ship wasn't just a machine. It was an instrument. I know, Jake muttered, half to himself and half to Zellerin. "I'm working as fast as I can, buddy." Zellerin let out a soft, musical hum in response, a sound Jake had learned to interpret as encouragement. The ship's core was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It wasn't a traditional engine or power source. It pulsed with energy, like a beating heart, and the crystalline structures surrounding it seemed to function as conduits, distributing energy throughout the ship. But many of these crystals were fractured or completely shattered, and Jake was running out of ideas and materials to fix them. He glanced at the pile of human tools and spare parts he brought with him. They were laughably primitive compared to the ship's advanced technology, but Jake had always been good at improvising. He grabbed a roll of conductive wire and a soldering tool, then turned back to the core. "Let's see if this works," he muttered. Carefully, Jake began threading the wire around one of the fractured crystals, creating a makeshift circuit to bypass the damaged section. As he worked, the ship's interior lights flickered, and a low hum filled the hangar. It was as though the ship was alive, reacting to his efforts. "Don't give up on me now," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. Zellerin stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the core. He raised a hand, and the glow from his chest intensified, casting a soft light over the area Jake was working on. The light seemed to resonate with the core, and for a moment, the hum grew stronger, more stable. "Are you boosting it?" Jake asked, glancing at Zellerin. The alien nodded slowly, his expression serious. "Good," Jake said. "Keep it up. We're getting somewhere." Piece by piece, Jake worked to stabilize the core. It was slow, painstaking work, but he could feel the ship responding to his efforts. The lights grew steadier, and the hum became a rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Just as Jake was starting to feel hopeful, a sharp, high-pitched sound pierced the air. He froze, his heart pounding. "What now?" he whispered. Zellerin let out a low growl, his gaze snapping toward the far end of the hangar. Jake followed his line of sight and felt his stomach drop. One of the monitors near the entrance was flashing red, and the screen displayed a series of unfamiliar symbols. "What's it saying?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with panic. Zellerin didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the monitor with surprising speed, his long fingers flying over the controls. The symbols shifted rapidly, and a low, ominous tone echoed through the hangar. Jake didn't need to understand alien language to know what it meant. "We've got company, don't we?" Zellerin turned to Jake, his expression grim. He made a series of gestures, pointing to the ship and then to himself. "You're saying they're coming for you?" Jake guessed. Zellerin nodded, his gaze sharp and focused. "Of course they are," Jake muttered, rubbing his temples. "Because fixing a living spaceship and keeping you alive wasn't hard enough already." The ship's hum grew louder, almost urgent, as though it was reacting to the danger. Jake turned back to the core, his mind racing. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "If they're coming, we need to be ready. This ship isn't flight-worthy yet, but maybe we can use its systems to defend ourselves." Celerin tilted his head, his gaze questioning. "Trust me," Jake said, grabbing a handful of tools. "If there's one thing humans are good at, it's making do with what we've got." Working quickly, Jake began rerouting some of the ship's remaining power to the external systems. He wasn't entirely sure how the ship's defenses worked, but he'd noticed several sections of the hull that seemed to house weaponry or shielding systems. As he worked, Celerin moved to the central control panel and began interacting with the ship's systems. The alien's movements were smooth and confident, a stark contrast to the weakened state he'd been in just hours ago. "Looks like you're back in the game," Jake said with a grin. Celerin glanced at him and let out a soft hum that Jake interpreted as agreement. The hangar lights flickered, and the monitor near the entrance emitted a sharp tone. Jake looked up to see a new symbol flashing on the screen, a triangular shape surrounded by smaller icons. "What's that mean?" Jake asked. Celerin's expression darkened, and he let out a low growl. "Let me guess," Jake said. "They're here." The sound of a distant explosion confirmed his suspicion. The ground shook, and dust rained down from the hangar ceiling. "Great," Jake muttered, grabbing a wrench. "Let's hope this ship's defenses are as good as they look." Celerin let out a series of sharp clicks and gestures, and the ship's interior lights flared to life. Panels along the walls slid open, revealing glowing orbs that began to rotate and emit a low hum. Jake's eyes widened. "Please tell me those are weapons." Celerin nodded, his gaze focused and determined. "All right," Jake said, his heart pounding. "Let's give them a fight they'll never forget." As the attackers closed in, Jake and Celerin worked together to activate the ship's defenses. It was a chaotic, desperate effort, but for the first time, Jake felt like they had a chance. The ship wasn't just a machine, it was a partner. And with Celerin by his side, Jake knew they could hold their ground. For now, at least. The enemy approaches. The first impact hit like a thunderclap, shaking the hangar and making Jake stumble. Sparks flew from the ship's control panel as Celerin worked feverishly, his long fingers dancing over glowing symbols. The alien's focus was unshakable, his movements smooth and deliberate. Jake, however, felt his heart hammering in his chest as another explosion rocked the facility. "They're not here to negotiate," Jake shouted, gripping the edge of the ship for balance. Celerin didn't need a translator to understand Jake's tone. He let out a series of sharp, melodic tones that resonated through the hangar. The ship responded immediately, the glowing veins along its hull intensifying. Panels opened along the sides, revealing what Jake could only hope were defensive systems. "What's the plan, partner?" Jake asked, looking to Celerin. The alien turned, his gaze sharp and focused. He pointed to Jake, then gestured toward the ship's internal systems. Jake understood the implication immediately. "Keep working." Jake grabbed his tools and dove back into the ship's inner workings. The core was stable for now, but he knew it wouldn't hold under prolonged stress, especially if the attackers had weapons capable of penetrating the hangar's reinforced walls. "All right, girl," Jake muttered to the ship as he tightened a loose conduit. "Let's see what you've got left in you." Outside, the attackers were making their presence known. The sound of heavy machinery echoed through the hangar, and Jake could make out the faint whine of plasma drills cutting through metal. Whoever these enemies were, they were serious about getting in, and about finishing what they'd started with Celerin's ship. "Any chance we can take off?" Jake called to Celerin. The alien glanced at him, then shook his head. He pointed to the ship's damaged engine, emitting a low, mournful hum. "Of course not," Jake muttered. "Why would anything be easy today?" Another explosion rocked the hangar, and this time, a section of the ceiling caved in. Dust and debris rained down, and Jake shielded his eyes as a massive piece of metal crashed to the floor. Through the opening, Jake caught his first glimpse of the attackers. They were humanoid but heavily armored, their suits sleek and angular, with glowing red visors that gave them an eerie, insect-like appearance. They moved with military precision, fanning out as they advanced toward the hangar. "Looks like they brought friends," Jake said grimly. Zelrin let out a sharp, commanding tone, and the ship's defenses roared to life. The glowing orbs Jake had noticed earlier rose into the air, emitting beams of concentrated light that lanced toward the attackers. The first wave was caught off guard, several of them disintegrating before they could react. "Now that's what I'm talking about," Jake said, a grin breaking across his face. But the attackers weren't unprepared. The second wave raised shields that absorbed the beams, and they returned fire with weapons that emitted bolts of searing energy. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, a cacophony of alien technology clashing in a deadly symphony. Jake felt the ship shudder as one of the energy bolts struck its hull. He cursed under his breath and worked faster, rerouting power to the defense systems. "We're running out of time," he shouted. Zelrin responded with a series of urgent tones, his glowing chest pulsing in rhythm with the ship's defenses. Jake realized the alien was pushing himself to his limits, channeling his energy directly into the ship to keep it functioning. "You can't keep this up, buddy," Jake said. "We need another plan." As if in response, the ship emitted a low, resonant hum that filled the hangar. The glowing veins along its hull pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, and Jake felt a strange vibration under his feet. "What's it doing now?" Jake asked, looking to Zelrin. The alien gestured toward the ceiling, where the attackers were starting to breach the hangar's interior. Jake squinted, trying to understand. And then it hit him. "You're charging something," he said. "A weapon?" Zelrin nodded, his expression grim. "Okay, but how long is that going to take?" Jake asked. The alien didn't answer directly, but the strain on his face told Jake everything he needed to know. The weapon was powerful, but it wasn't ready yet, and it wouldn't be ready in time to stop the attackers from overrunning the hangar. "Right," Jake muttered, his mind racing. "Then we'll just have to buy you some time." He grabbed a handheld plasma torch from his toolkit and turned to face the advancing attackers. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Hey, shiny guys," he shouted, stepping out from behind the ship. "Over here." The attackers turned toward him, their glowing visors focusing on the lone human. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline as he ignited the plasma torch, the bright blue flame casting shadows across the hangar. "Yeah, that's right," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear pounding in his chest. "Come and get me." The attackers charged, their weapons raised, and Jake ducked behind a pile of debris, leading them away from the ship. He used the torch to cut through a support beam, sending a section of scaffolding crashing down and blocking their path. "Catch me if you can," Jake shouted, darting toward the far side of the hangar. Behind him, the ship's defenses continued to fire, and Zelrin worked tirelessly to prepare the weapon. Jake knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he didn't have a choice. If he could buy just a few more minutes, it might be enough to turn the tide. The attackers pursued him relentlessly, their weapons carving through obstacles with precision. Jake narrowly avoided a plasma bolt, the heat searing his arm as it passed. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, his mind focused on one thing, giving Zelrin the time he needed. Finally, the ship let out a deafening hum, and the lights along its hull flared to life. Jake turned to see Zelrin standing at the controls, his glowing chest pulsing in sync with the ship's energy. The weapon was ready. "Do it," Jake shouted. Zelrin let out a final, triumphant tone, and the ship unleashed a blinding beam of energy. The attackers didn't stand a chance. The beam swept through the hangar, disintegrating everything in its path. The air was filled with the sound of crackling energy, and when the light finally faded, the attackers were gone. Jake collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Zelrin approached, his expression calm but weary. He extended a hand, and Jake took it, letting the alien help him to his feet. "Nice work, partner," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Celerin let out a soft, melodic hum, the sound carrying a sense of relief and gratitude. For now, they were safe. But Jake knew the fight wasn't over. The ingenious trap. The silence after the battle was deafening. Jake leaned against the ship, catching his breath as the adrenaline drained from his system. The hangar was in shambles. Smoke billowed from scorched metal, and the faint scent of ozone lingered in the air. Celerin stood nearby, his tall figure silhouetted against the dim, flickering lights. The alien's glowing chest pulsed faintly, matching the rhythmic hum of the ship. "Good job back there," Jake said, his voice raspy. "But I don't think we've seen the last of them." Celerin tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly. He made a series of gestures, pointing first to the destroyed monitors and then to the ship. Jake frowned, trying to decipher the message. "You're saying they're tracking us?" Jake guessed. Celerin nodded, his expression grim. "Of course they are," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Because why would anything be simple?" The alien moved toward the ship's control panel, his movements deliberate but slower than before. Jake could tell that the battle had taken a toll on him. The glowing veins along his body flickered slightly, and his posture was more rigid than usual. "Hey, take it easy," Jake said. "You're not a machine, you know." Celerin glanced at him, his expression unreadable, then returned his attention to the controls. The ship emitted a low hum, and a series of holographic displays appeared around Celerin. Symbols and patterns danced across the projections, too complex for Jake to understand. Jake sighed and turned his attention to the wreckage in the hangar. The attackers had been obliterated, but their equipment remained. He approached one of the smoldering piles, carefully picking through the debris. "What are you looking for?" he muttered to himself. After a few minutes, Jake found what he was hoping for. A small, intact device about the size of a human fist. It was sleek and metallic, with faintly glowing lines etched across its surface. "Bingo," Jake said, holding it up to the light. He returned to Celerin, who was still immersed in the ship's controls. Jake tapped the alien on the shoulder, and Celerin turned to face him. "Look what I found," Jake said, holding up the device. "Some kind of tracker, maybe. If we can figure out how it works, we might be able to use it against them." Celerin examined the device, his glowing eyes narrowing. He let out a series of soft hums, then gestured for Jake to place the device on the control panel. Jake hesitated. "You're not going to accidentally set it off, are you?" Celerin gave him a look that Jake interpreted as mildly offended. All right," Jake said, placing the device on the panel. "Just checking." The ship's systems hummed softly as Celerin began analyzing the device. Patterns of light danced across the control panel, and the glowing veins on the ship pulsed in time with the holographic displays. As Celerin worked, Jake's mind raced. The attackers had been relentless, and it was clear they wouldn't stop until Celerin, and likely his ship, were destroyed. They needed more than a defensive strategy. They needed a plan to strike back. "Hey," Jake said, leaning against the panel. "What if we turned the tables on them?" Celerin glanced at him, his head tilted slightly. "You know, set a trap," Jake continued. "Lure them in and hit them where it hurts. They think they're hunting us, but we make them the prey." Celerin's gaze sharpened, and he let out a low hum of approval. "Yeah, I thought you'd like that idea," Jake said with a grin. "But we'll need to get creative. They've got the numbers and the firepower. We've got, well, you and this ship." Celerin gestured toward the device on the control panel, then made a series of rapid motions with his hands. "You can use their tracker against them," Jake guessed. Celerin nodded, his movements confident. He began working on the control panel, the ship's systems humming louder as he manipulated the device. Jake watched in awe as Celerin created a holographic projection of what appeared to be the attacker's network. The alien was isolating their communications and pinpointing their location. "You're a genius, you know that," Jake said. Zellerin let out a soft hum, his glowing eyes focused on the display. As the plan took shape, Jake's excitement grew. They would use the tracker to send a false signal, drawing the attackers to a location of their choosing. Once the enemy was in position, the ship's systems would unleash a devastating counterattack. But there was one problem. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his tone serious. "This hangar won't hold if they come back with reinforcements." Zellerin nodded, his expression grim. He gestured toward the ship's engine, then made a series of quick, sharp motions. "You're saying the engine can handle a short jump?" Jake asked. Zellerin nodded again, though his posture suggested it wasn't without risk. "All right," Jake said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's make it happen." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jake worked tirelessly to stabilize the engine, while Zellerin continued refining the trap. The ship's systems hummed and pulsed, the glowing veins growing brighter as energy surged through them. Finally, everything was ready. The false signal had been sent, and the ship's engine was primed for a short-range jump. "Let's do this," Jake said, strapping himself into the co-pilot's seat. Zellerin activated the controls, and the ship emitted a low, resonant hum. The hangar around them blurred as the engine roared to life, and within moments, they were gone. They emerged in a remote asteroid field, the jagged rocks providing natural cover. Zellerin guided the ship into position, its systems ready to unleash the trap. Minutes later, the attackers arrived, their sleek ships swarming into the area. They had taken the bait. "Showtime," Jake said, his adrenaline spiking. Zellerin activated the ship's systems, and the asteroid field lit up with deadly precision. Energy beams lanced out, tearing through the enemy ships with ruthless efficiency. The attackers, caught off guard, tried to retreat, but the ship's systems anticipated their movements, cutting them down one by one. Within minutes, the battle was over. The asteroid field was silent once more, and the attackers were nothing but debris. Jake let out a shaky breath, a grin spreading across his face. "We did it." Zellerin turned to him, his glowing eyes softening. He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, letting out a melodic hum that conveyed gratitude and respect. "For the record," Jake said, "you're the best partner I've ever had." Zellerin let out a low, amused tone, and for the first time, Jake felt like he truly understood the alien. But even as they celebrated their victory, Jake knew this wasn't the end. The attackers might be gone for now, but their mission, whatever it was far from over. And Jake had a feeling he was now part of something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. Humanity's unexpected ally. The silence of the asteroid field was almost unnerving after the chaos of battle. Jake slumped in the co-pilot's seat, staring out the viewport at the debris floating in the distance. The attackers' sleek ships had been reduced to little more than glowing wreckage, their metallic husks drifting aimlessly among the asteroids. Zellerin, seated at the main console, was motionless for a moment. His glowing chest pulsed faintly, his energy clearly drained from the intense maneuvering and combat. He let out a soft hum, a tone Jake had learned to interpret as relief mixed with caution. "Yeah, we made it," Jake said, giving the alien a tired grin. "Barely." The ship emitted a low hum, its glowing veins dimming slightly as it began to power down non-essential systems. Jake could feel the tension in the air easing, but a nagging sense of unease still lingered. "All right, partner," Jake said, pulling himself to his feet. "Now that we're not about to die, how about you tell me what's really going on here?" Zellerin turned to him, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward the ship's central console, and a series of holographic projections appeared. Jake watched as the alien manipulated the symbols, creating an intricate pattern of light and energy that formed a three-dimensional map of the galaxy. Jake's eyes widened. "This is where we are." Zellerin nodded, then pointed to a small, glowing section of the map. He made a series of gestures, and the hologram shifted, zooming in on what appeared to be a cluster of stars surrounded by ominous red markers. "That doesn't look good," Jake said, crossing his arms. Xelorian let out a low, mournful hum, then pointed to himself, the ship, and the red-marked area on the map. Jake frowned, trying to piece it together. "You're saying your people are in trouble?" Jake guessed. Xelorian nodded, his glowing eyes dimming slightly. He gestured toward the debris field outside, then back to the map, indicating the attackers. "They're the ones causing it, aren't they?" Jake asked. Xelorian let out a soft hum of agreement. He pointed to the red-marked area again, then made a series of sharp, urgent motions. "They're not just after you," Jake said, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "They're after your entire species." The alien's posture stiffened, and he nodded again, his expression somber. Jake ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small cockpit. "Okay, so let me get this straight. You're part of some advanced race. These guys are trying to wipe you out. And you're what? On a mission to stop them." Xelorian hesitated, then gestured toward Jake and the map, his movements slower this time. Jake frowned, struggling to interpret the alien's message. "Wait," Jake said, narrowing his eyes. "You came here for us." Xelorian's gaze met his, and the alien nodded. Jake froze, his mind racing. "You're telling me you came to Earth looking for help?" Xelorian let out a low, melodic tone, a sound that conveyed both hope and urgency. He gestured toward Jake, then made a sweeping motion across the map, indicating the entire galaxy. "You think humanity can help stop them?" Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien nodded again, his glowing chest pulsing faintly. Jake sank back into the co-pilot's seat, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and doubt. Humanity wasn't exactly known for being the most united or advanced species. Sure, they had their moments of brilliance, but they were also deeply flawed, prone to conflict and division. "You really think we're ready for something like this?" Jake asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. Xelorian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and let out a soft, resonant hum. The sound was calming, almost reassuring, and Jake felt a strange sense of determination settle over him. "All right," Jake said, meeting the alien's gaze. "Let's say I believe you. Let's say we can help. How do we convince the rest of humanity to listen? Most people don't even know aliens exist, let alone that there's some interstellar war happening out here." Xelorian gestured toward the holographic map again, this time highlighting Earth. He made a series of sharp, deliberate motions, then pointed to Jake. "Me?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. "You want me to deliver the message?" The alien nodded, his expression unwavering. Jake let out a dry laugh. "Great. No pressure or anything." He leaned back, staring at the hologram as the weight of the situation settled over him. Xelorian wasn't just asking for help. He was asking Jake to be the bridge between two worlds, to convince humanity to rise to a challenge they didn't even know existed. But as daunting as it was, Jake couldn't deny the spark of excitement that stirred within him. This was bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, humanity was capable of rising to the occasion. "All right, partner," Jake said, standing and extending his hand to Xelorian. "Let's do this. Together." Xelorian clasped Jake's hand, his grip firm but gentle. The alien let out a melodic tone that resonated through the ship, filling the air with a sense of unity and purpose. As the ship's systems began powering up again, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was part of something much bigger, something that could change the course of the galaxy. The ship rose from the asteroid field, its glowing veins pulsing with renewed energy. Jake and Xelorian sat side by side in the cockpit, their gazes fixed on the stars ahead. "Next stop, Earth," Jake said with a grin. "Let's go save the galaxy."